Okay, so I think we'll get started. So, welcome everyone. My name is Katie Chalice. I'm the Director of Privacy at the Utah State Board of Education. And I'm really excited to turn the time over here in just a minute to Jeremy Zabriskie, who's our Data Privacy and Security Specialist, to present on, I think, a pretty exciting topic. And so the majority of the time will be in Jeremy's hands. I might chime in every now and then just to kind of like establish some norms. So feel free to keep your cameras on if you want to, but there's no expectation. So if you're on the fence, feel free to turn your camera off. As far as questions go, feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along. And some of those questions I might answer in the chat, but I'll also be saving some questions for the end. So basically, like we'll go through the duration of the presentation and open it up to questions at the end. All right, I'm so excited. All right, Jeremy, let's turn it over to you. And again, feel free to keep your cameras off and questions you can put in the chat.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I gotta say, exciting topic. Definitely a relative term there. We think it's exciting. And also, yes, hello, everyone. Happy and good 11 a.m. to you all. We'll get going here. Just wanted to cover the agenda really quickly. So for this first little bit, I'd like to give some background on the investigation, background on the relevant laws, requirements, and agreements, and then we'll get into the investigation methodology, a walkthrough of the results, what USB did in the follow-up after the report, well, toward the end of the report, and then our observations and recommendations. So if you're a data manager, which I think that there are probably a lot of you, you can probably tune out for some of the beginning because you know it already, but we'll go through it anyway. So yeah, the background. In 2023, the Utah State Board of Education commissioned this investigation from BYU. BYU performed the investigation in partnership with Internet Safety Labs, a nonprofit organization. Toward the end, USBE's data privacy team, us, collaborated on the report in order to contact vendors and share the results with them. And we can send out the slides at the end, and then this link goes to the report, and we can give you a link to that as well. And it should be in the email that you received. The investigation set out to answer 3 questions. What educational technology or EdTech apps are being used throughout the state? What are the data privacy agreements governing the use of those apps? And what is the actual data collected and shared by each app? Again, for some additional context, it may be useful to go through some of the regulatory mechanisms associated with student data privacy. So first and foremost, you have the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act from 1974, the granddaddy of student data privacy laws. And then in 1998, the Children's Online Privacy Act was passed, which is a federal law regulating online collection of personal information from children under 13 years old. And then finally, we have the Utah Student Data Protection Act, passed in 2016, which expands on the requirements of FERPA and created our team. So thank you, SDPA. I'd like to note that I'll be using the term LEA a lot, which stands for Local Education Agency and refers to districts and charter schools. The SDPA requires USBE and each LEA to create a metadata dictionary, or MDD, which is a list of third parties with whom the entity shares student data, as well as the justification and purpose for the sharing. Most of the entries in an LEA's metadata dictionary are going to be EdTech products used in the LEA, which means that the MDD can be thought of as a list of approved applications. In order to meet the requirements of the SDPA, when LEAs contract with EdTech companies, they have to make sure that certain contractual provisions are in place. The easiest way that they do that is by signing data privacy agreements, or DPAs. LEAs then use the MDD to list those applications and reference the signed DPAs for those apps. It's a lot of initialisms, so hopefully you can keep track. I should note that I'll probably use the term apps a lot through this presentation as well. Apps in this case is going to refer to websites, installed software, mobile applications, any online service receiving student data. Um, you'll see that same terminology in the report, that it's all just sort of called an app, though most of the time we're talking about websites. Okay, so let's talk about agreements. There are many different types of agreements that may be associated with EdTech apps used throughout the state. Um, so we'll cover most of them at a pretty surface level. And today I won't be talking about badges or privacy policies, but you can read more about those in the report. The most common, and one we've already alluded to, is the National Data Privacy Agreement, which is provided by Access for Learning and the Student Data Privacy Consortium, or SDPC, of which Utah is a member. SDPC provides a platform for LEAs to manage their DPAs with vendors. Some of our LEAs use the SDPC as their MDD, and all of them use it to manage DPAs. The DPA is filled out by both the vendor and the LEA and enforces provisions that allow both parties to be compliant with FERPA and our state privacy laws. Later, as we talk about the report, we'll refer to a few specific exhibits within the DPA, so I wanted to cover those really quickly as well. First is the Exhibit A, which is where a vendor lists which of their services or products the DPA applies to. Often vendors will also provide a description of those services, and sometimes, in my experience, this section can be pretty vague. Next is the Exhibit B, which is where a vendor lists the specific student data that the service will collect or process. And I would hope that this is obvious, but I'll note that the image is cropped. There are a lot of data elements in the Exhibit B. It's, I think, a couple of pages. And finally, though this exhibit isn't necessarily relevant to the investigation, as of this year, we've begun rolling out a new version of the DPA 2.1, which includes the Exhibit G. The Exhibit G lets Utah list state-specific requirements. In it, we reiterate an LEA's ability to audit their third-party contractors, which is spelled out in state law, and we will talk about a bit. We also request the vendor to provide a list of their sub-processors. A sub-processor or subcontractor can be thought of as a fourth party the EdTech company uses for data collection, analysis, storage, or some other service in order to operate or improve their product. Sub-processors can handle student data, but they're required by the DPA to have agreements in place and to handle that data in no less stringent a manner than the original vendor. And I should also note that the DPA states that student data that an LEA shares with the provider belongs to the LEA. Throughout the agreement, the LEA should be able to maintain control over it and allow parents to exercise their FERPA rights to inspect, review, and request amendment of data. Another addition to the Exhibit G is this form for the vendor to fill out that's similar to the Exhibit B, but for employee data. So vendors should be indicating to us the personal data of teachers or employees that may be shared with the app. I think one benefit of this is that it will help to make the Exhibit B more accurate, as vendors will have a different place for more specific non-student data elements. And again, that is some foreshadowing. Another common type of agreement for using EdTech applications throughout the state are statewide agreements. USBE, for example, provides certain services for LEAs to use, such as assessment technology. Our contracts bake in the necessary student data protections to be compliant with the law. Similarly, UEN, the Utah Education Network, provides free or low-cost access to a variety of tools and services. They also review those contracts for privacy considerations. And finally, some additional services are available through the STEM Action Center. Okay, so with that background out of the way, we can move into the actual investigation. First, BYU determined which apps are in use throughout the state. The majority of this data was pulled from SDPC and the metadata dictionaries. Their review found that there were about 3,000 apps, though that number may not be entirely accurate, as some apps may not be in use or be discontinued but still present in SDPC. Next, they scraped the relevant DPAs to extract the data elements that are listed by the vendors in the Exhibit B, which they then stored in a database. Obviously, they can't review 3,000 apps, so they narrowed the list down to about 100. They didn't just choose the top 100 most commonly apps in use. Instead, they opted for a mix of apps under different agreements and those that require authentication versus those that don't. And this is probably a good time to note that BYU and ISL partnered with an LEA to gain access to some of the applications from a purpose-created student account, but understandably, they didn't have accounts for all 100 apps. ISL then performed network traffic analysis on those 100 apps. The researcher signed in or created an account as a student under the age of 13 to simultaneously observe adherence to COPPA. The researcher then performed various tasks in order to generate traffic on the application. Real quick, I'd like to explain network traffic analysis or testing. This refers to examining web requests and responses between the user's computer and the web servers associated with the website or application. There are many tools for accomplishing this, but even at a very basic level, you can see a lot of this information using your browser's developer tools. In the future, I think I may host another webinar showing how an LEA could do this style of investigation, which I think could be useful. Again, for some foreshadowing. This type of analysis will typically reveal things about a website such as cookies, subprocessors, tracking pixels, data sharing, things like that. And I'm not going to go into the next few slides in like a super amount of depth, but I included them for your reference. The most important thing to note here is that data is sent to the server in the request body of the post. But again, you don't need to worry too much about that. But another thing I want to cover is the concept of cookies. Cookies are small blocks of data stored on your computer that can be used for plenty of legitimate essential things, like storing your cart information or keeping you logged in. But cookies can also be used to track you or serve advertisements based on your previous browsing history or observed demographics, which is obviously simplifying the nature of that kind of traffic and marketing quite heavily. And the last note here is that third-party tracking cookies are becoming less common. A lot of browsers block them by default. And so instead, they are being replaced increasingly by other workarounds, and in my opinion, sometimes more nefarious workarounds and techniques like fingerprinting. So cookies, while important, are not the whole story. Sure. And again, this is just a slide explaining how some of the third-party cookies work in terms of retargeting, which is a type of advertising. And so yeah, network traffic testing is useful, but it isn't perfect. The pros are that it's relatively easy to get information. As mentioned, you could learn a lot from using basic tools available to you right now. Another benefit is that it's asynchronous. You don't have to coordinate with a vendor to plan some big audit. You can just sort of do it on your free time. Additionally, with the right expertise and likely agreements in place, an auditor could reveal security vulnerabilities present in the web application, which again, is sort of outside the scope of what we're talking about, but again, it is a benefit of this type of analysis. As for cons, it's not a full picture of a vendor's security at all, as there are plenty of vulnerabilities that can arise through other channels. This analysis is really only going to show you things that happen between your computer and theirs. So if some vendor were secretly selling student data through a back channel or something like that, you'd never learn about that through this type of analysis. It's just things that happen between your computer and theirs, basically. Another con is that this type of analysis requires some requisite knowledge and expertise to do effectively and accurately, and time, for sure. There are also other times when this wouldn't work very well, such as special assessment browsers or when a company's app is an embedded Unity game, for example, which you see sometimes. And finally, you would also ideally want to have an account as a student within an LEA that was paying for the service or had some other contractual relationship, which again is foreshadowing. Okay, so with that second level of context setting out of the way, we can now talk about the results. When you look at the report, you'll see a big old table with all 100 applications in it. So I wanted to sort of walk you through how to read that. First, you'll notice that some of the names are visible and others are numbers with superscripts. Every vendor was sent a copy of their results and given an opportunity to respond. Those who provided sufficient response, or those who mitigated the issues, or those who provided evidence against the requested actions, were offered optional redaction. The superscripts try to explain the nature of that redaction. A means that the vendor chose to have their name in the report. B means that they responded adequately to the requested actions and opt to redact their name. And I feel like I should note that some of the vendors who chose redaction had no issues at all. Their results were completely clean, but they still chose to be redacted. Others, even though they are redacted, I still felt like there'd probably be value in following up in some way because I still had some concerns. So redaction isn't inherently good or bad. C, the vendor didn't provide sufficient response. There's only one of those. D, the vendor didn't respond at all. Finding a contact wasn't always easy. I tried to include as many details about that as possible in the appendix entries, explaining the attempts that I made. So moving on, this column shows the total elements allowed as indicated in the vendor's Exhibit B of the DPA. For statewide agreements, those don't request specific data elements, or that information isn't published anywhere readily or easily, so those are left blank in the table. Next, allowed but not collected, which means that it was marked on the Exhibit B but not identified during testing. There are a few reasons for this, which I can talk about later if somebody would like. The second is allowed and collected. This means that there was alignment between the Exhibit B and the network analysis. And finally, the salmon colored entry means that the network analysis identified elements that were being collected but weren't listed on the Exhibit B. Occasionally, this variance arose from misunderstandings on the part of the vendor, which I'll comment on later. Moving on to data sharing, the first column shows how many data elements were shared in total. As mentioned earlier, sharing with a third party isn't automatically bad, as long as there are agreements in place and the sub-processors are handling data safely. But there is always a risk in data sharing, so it's ideal if this number is low. The not allowed column means that these elements were collected and shared, but not listed on the Exhibit B. And you might have picked up on this by now, but salmon means bad. So just keep that in mind. Next, this section shows the number of recipients. Again, the first column isn't necessarily bad. However, any entry in the EdTech companies column is very concerning and should be examined. FERPA, the SDPA, and COPPA all disallow using student data for targeting or behavioral advertising and or selling student data generally. The definitions in all three are a little different, but the notion is the same. But as you look through this EdTech companies column, you'll see these asterisks. We'll talk about this in greater detail later, but these asterisks mean that the vendor provided evidence or assurance that the advertising is not present on student-facing accounts or within their education-specific offerings. There were a whole lot of reasons that this might have an asterisk, which brings me to another important thing to note, which is that the table and the associated appendix entries at the bottom represent a snapshot in time. So even if a vendor did completely refute the results that were sent to them, the results weren't changed in the table or their appendix entry. That's why redaction and these kind of qualifying symbols made the most sense. So keeping in mind, again, the table is a snapshot. Here are the sort of tabulated results. In terms of data sharing, 52% were collecting, the Exhibit B, 52% were collecting data elements not indicated in the Exhibit B. 39% were sharing with any third parties, and 36% were sharing with ad tech companies. I do want to focus on this one a bit. The 36% number, obviously alarming, but it isn't necessarily definitive, as we'll sort of see in some commentary later. However, it does indicate that we should follow up on those results because, again, it is concerning. After the results were compiled and the report was written, it was nearly done. We were then directed by the board to send the results to the vendors and give them an opportunity to respond and sort of engage in that sort of back and forth follow-up. So the process of that, ISL provided us with the raw data files, which were Burp Suite files. Burp Suite is a web application analysis tool. These files contain the HTML files, scripts, requests, and responses for each testing. So I went through the results, double checking and preparing screenshots and determining the requested actions. And then we sent the letters to the vendors. Again, I already hinted at this, but immediately I'll note an issue that I think we should address or work on, which is that contacting the vendors was not always easy. First, we looked at the contact information on the DPA because when a vendor signs it, they provide their name and an email address. But sometimes that directed to a person who no longer worked at the company. So we just received like a bounce back. Then we sent emails to addresses listed in privacy policies, which were sometimes ignored as well. And then as a last resort, I'd submit service tickets, which were also sometimes ignored. It felt a bit concerning to me that if I can't even find someone to talk to, do LEAs have a good contact in place? Do they have someone that they can ask questions to and raise concerns to? So yeah, something to think about. There were 4 categories of requested actions sent to the vendors. First, Exhibit B mismatch. This is when the vendors' test results didn't match their DPA. 50 vendors in total received this. 31 signed or committed to sign a new DPA. 13 vendors explained the variances, which negated needing a new DPA, and 5 vendors didn't respond at all. Next, aggregators or analytics. Aggregators was a term that was used by ISL in their report to refer to big companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon Web Services, etc. Companies whom they may rely on for analytics or cloud hosting or other services, but for whom their privacy practices aren't always clear. Analytics platforms like Google Analytics can be configured to be GDPR compliant and completely anonymous, but they can also be configured to assist with advertising. So we requested evidence or assurances that this wasn't the case. 54 vendors in total received this one. 48 of them provided assurances or evidence of the anonymous nature of the analytics, and 6 vendors modified misconfigurations. I didn't get the sense that these misconfigurations were malicious or intentional. But to be fair, I also don't know that a vendor would tell me if they were, but I didn't get the sense that they were. A few explanations I received related to upgrading from Google Analytics 3 to Google Analytics 4. A few vendors mentioned that. Social media was the next requested action item. This wasn't a category that was in the investigation initially. Usually these companies were considered as part of aggregators or advertisers in the report, but I decided to call them out on their own because my review of the files gave me the impression that these were sometimes unintentional. For example, there are quite a few social media plugins that will let you share pages to social media or use social media to sign into websites. These plugins, which people can just sort of like get online, often set tracking cookies or utilize tracking pixels. We'll talk about this later, but sometimes these cookies were the subject of debates back and forth a bit. So in terms of social media, 11 vendors received this item. 3 of the vendors corrected the issue, changed configurations, removed them from their pages. 4 vendors stated that social media integrations aren't present once a student logs in, and then 3 vendors didn't respond. 1 vendor indicated that the site was only meant for teachers. There were a couple of those throughout the report. Now on to the big one, advertising related entities. Vendors received this item when there was evidence of advertising or tracking pixels or cookies associated with known advertisers. It's important to note, and it will come up later, but USB was not always aware of the type of accounts used by the researcher. A good example is that there are commercial services that also offer education versions of their apps. Occasionally, through digging through those files that I mentioned earlier, I found that the researcher was using the commercial version, presumably unaware that there was an education version. Other times I wasn't able to discern that. So in times like that, I kind of had to take the vendor's word that they didn't utilize advertising in their education versions, which is why I think that some follow-up would be good in those cases. I also want to note that there is overlap. So a vendor could receive this as a requested action and receive social media or receive, analytics. Um, for example, the advertising might have come from the analytics. So another very common source of this advertising traffic was from video embeds. There are ways of embedding YouTube videos so that they don't place tracking cookies, but the default behavior is that they do. So sometimes it was just an oversight like that, where the vendor was using YouTube embeds in their site without realizing that there are some settings that they should probably change. So 28 vendors received this item. 7 vendors had free or paid services that behaved differently in terms of advertising. 6 vendors indicated that their commercial product differs from their education specific product. But one of the vendors ended up making changes to the education specific version as a result of the letter. 2 vendors indicated that the service is only meant for educators, and one of those addressed the issue regardless. 2 vendors provided evidence that the traffic doesn't occur when a student signs in. One vendor adequately explained the anonymous nature of the advertising, which is kind of like a special case. One vendor's privacy policy openly states that they advertise. That application should obviously not be used by students. Seemingly it isn't, according to my review in SDPC. It's usually used just by teachers, but 4 vendors did not respond, and then 7 in total modified or had already modified their website to address the requested action. The process of reviewing these files and communicating back and forth with the vendors was really illuminating and, in my opinion, valuable. So I want to talk about some of those observations. First, on a positive note, I was pleased by almost all of the vendors' willingness to respond and the desire to get things right, which is expressed by this picture. It was almost all of them were really great to work with, but there were still a few that were remained incalcitrant throughout it. But I worked in customer service and IT for many years and had found that the best first approach in a potentially fraught situation is warmth. So I tried to do that in every case. There were, there were times when they were occasionally defensive, especially upon first contact. But when the vendors realized that my message wasn't meant to be punitive and that I was asking for collaboration, usually their tone softened a bit. Not always, but usually. I'm uncertain if this collaborative spirit was the result of my being from the state uh, and the threat of publishing their names, but I'd like to believe that this same collaboration would be possible between an LEA and a vendor as well. In my previous role working at an LEA, there were quite a few vendors with whom I had a pretty good relationship and felt that I could talk to and ask questions to, and that they would address my concerns. So I do think it's possible. Another huge takeaway is that data handling varies by product offering. Some vendors offer free and paid versions of their applications or standard and education versions. These specific versions can behave wildly differently as it relates to advertising, especially. As mentioned, using student data for targeted advertising is prohibited by law, and that requirement is reflected in the DPA. But even when a vendor might have assigned DPA, they're not always clear to the LEA that it only applies to the paid service or the education-specific service. This is an issue. It's fairly easy for LEAs to subscribe to DPAs. So you might start using the free version of a product because it has a DPA and you think it's safe, completely unaware of the fact that the vendor is not handling your student data in a way that meets the requirements of the law. In follow-ups, I did request that these vendors indicate in their Exhibit A that the DPA only applies to the paid version or to the education-specific version. And a lot of them were perfectly amenable to that. And I do think that our LEAs also need to do their due diligence when vetting applications in making sure that they're using the right version, which unfortunately often means that you have to read privacy policies, which are very boring, but good to be safe. Continuing this topic, I noted that it was often far easier to get on the same page with vendors who only work in the education space. When it's like when it's a vendor that has a commercial product and an education product, um, just felt like there was more misunderstandings there. Whereas the education specific vendors, they spoke my language in a way that was easier to work with them. So yeah, and also when working with vendors who dealt in both, it was occasionally difficult to get in touch with someone who could speak confidently to student data privacy questions or even know what I was asking. That wasn't always the case. There were plenty of knowledgeable and helpful vendors who had clear lines between their services, but it was an observation. Um, this next one is something that I've seen before, but the truth of it was reiterated as part of this review, which is the tendency for companies to be acquired and merged represents a very real risk to student data privacy. Often the organizational chaos that emerges and the shuffling or reduction in staff means that existing processes may be forgotten or existing contacts for LEAs who know their customers and their needs are no longer available. The DPA stipulates there should be 60 days notice to LEAs, but I'm unaware how common that practice is. I'm not sure what the answer is here other than vigilance, asking questions when you know that a service has been merged or acquired. And yeah, for the sake of time, I won't ramble about it, but you can read in the report all about an experience in this area. So that's in there. Another observation is that our definitions may not always align. For example, many of the Exhibit B mismatches arose because the vendor thought that it only applied to data that was provided by the LEA and not data that they create as part of a student using it or data that the student supplies themselves. This misunderstanding may have arisen from the definitions in older DPAs. The newest version of the DPA makes it much more clear that student data is a broad category that includes data that the vendor creates, handles, and processes related to the student. There were also occasionally uncertainties about what elements fit where in the Exhibit B. For example, student in-app performance on the Exhibit B encompasses quite a few different student activities, but some vendors captured some of those same things in other categories. There is a definition list available for the Exhibit B that I think somebody from our team had created a while ago, but it is out of date at this point. So I think that there would be value in updating that. Also, I'd like to talk again about the cookie issue and the tracker issue generally, especially as it relates here. Often, again, the commercial websites will have many trackers on their homepages. And even if all of those tracking technologies are disabled when a student signs in, the student has to go through the homepage to log in, which may set cookies or result in tracking. Again, this was an area of debate with vendors, some of whom felt that the cookie consent banners were sufficient, but some vendors did say that they'll pursue ways of addressing these concerns. And ultimately, I'm not really sure how big of an issue this is in schools who often rely on SSO tools like Clever or ClassLink, but it was an observation. So ideally, if we can, it's best to get our students to the login page and not through the home pages. And also, just generally with Nicole on leave, I've been reviewing a lot more DPAs, and I think that we need to align with vendors on topics such as de-identified data and retention and destruction. And again, I won't go into that too much here because it's not necessarily related, but it just seems like more evidence that our definitions and standards may not always be aligned. So finally, as part of these observations, we've been considering what we should do now that we have these results. First of all, I do think that more auditing would be beneficial. LEAs have the legal justification to engage in auditing, but I'm unaware of any examples of this happening historically. As part of that back and forth with vendors, I also feel that auditing doesn't always have to be some bad, punitive thing. When I was reviewing the vendors' files, there were times when I was really impressed by how simple and or intentional the data practices were, how seriously they seemed to take privacy. When sharing these good results with vendors, some of them felt really proud to be acknowledged for their good work. They wanted to post the results on the website, or they thanked us for it. Um, Auditing could be a way to celebrate and reinforce good behavior. And in this case, it did result in vendors identifying issues that they missed, and those configuration changes then benefited all students who use the service. And when the behavior isn't good, and you identify that, then we could pursue enforcement to ensure that vendors know that Utah takes student data privacy very seriously. Finally, I do think that quick and simple network analysis can be an important first step in identifying vendors that may require additional scrutiny, and it wouldn't take too long with the right, again, experience and expertise. Um, Another thing we considered is, more LEA training. We love providing trainings for LEAs, and I think that this report and other future data-driven revelations may help guide the areas where we think LEAs need more support or clarity. Related, our team has talked about creating more resources for vendors to ensure that we're all on the same page. Again, those conversations that I had with vendors, I felt were really valuable in sort of talking through some of that. So if we could have things like checklists or one pagers or infographics or whatever, things to really drive home the importance of our very favorite DPA provisions, I think that that could be really helpful. And as noted, uh, there are specific enforcement options provided by 53E9310 that, again, haven't been used to my knowledge. These options could be an important lever in cases where vendors are less amenable to feedback than those I interacted with. And this could help to prevent LEAs from using products that are known to be problematic. Um, and those are just some of the things that we've thought about, but we're completely open to suggestion. So if you read through this report and if you identify anything that you think that we could do to help in this area, please just reach out to us at privacy@schools.utah.gov.